Today's video. Today is Monday, September 22nd, 2025, and today we have some news out of the state of Georgia. I'm actually a few days late on this, but some pretty big news insofar that the former Republican lieutenant governor under Brian Kemp from 2019 to 2023 has now filed to run for governor in the Peach State as a Democrat in the 2026 midterm elections. Now, Jeff Duncan has been a longtime Republican. His entire life he's been registered as a member of the GOP, but after Donald Trump denied the results of the 2020 presidential election, he immediately turned on Republicans across the country for enabling the president's behavior and uplifting what he felt ultimately disagreed at its core with traditional conservative values. To which at that point he decided he would not seek re-election with Governor Brian Kemp, instead allowing him to have another lieutenant governor not appointed, but to run in that election and take his place after the next cycle. And then he went out publicly, came out and endorsed Kamala Harris in the last election, spoke at the Democratic National Convention. He became a pretty recognizable name on both sides of the aisle because of his dynamism, right? The switch here from Republican to Democrat, being someone who held a lot of conservative policy positions that now no longer does. Now, this is pretty big news just so far that there is a former Republican lieutenant governor running as a Democrat in Georgia. It's probably one of the biggest shifts we've seen in recent memory, especially considering that most of the time we actually find that a lot of these changes in political party and political affiliation have largely been towards the Republican Party or leaving the Democratic Party. Think about Karine Jean-Pierre, President Biden's press secretary in office, now a registered independent, right? Think about the Senate Minority Leader for Democrats in Florida, now a registered independent. Taking a look the way in which, we have seen the trend lines at least go when it comes down to Democrat versus Republican Party affiliation. Oftentimes you aren't finding that it is these high-profile names that are switching from Republican to Democrat, much less running for a competitive office under that role. Now, there's a lot of conversation around the 2026 governor's race in the state of Georgia, and arguably for good reason. On the Democratic side, we've already touched briefly on it here with Jeff Duncan in the race as the former Republican LT Gov, but also there are a number of candidates that are running in Georgia, and the Democratic primary is absolutely going to be competitive. Lucy McBath, the representative from Georgia's 6th district, who, fun fact here, actually ended up winning the race that Jon Ossoff lost to Karen Handel in the special election in 2017. About a year and a half later, Lucy McBath went on to be the U.S. representative from that same district and maintains it till today. She had intended and, in fact, announced that she was running for governor early on this year, but unfortunately, due to health complications with her husband, decided that she was going to be temporarily suspending her campaign, then was recently asked, will you fire this campaign back up? She said, absolutely not. I'm staying in Washington, D.C., and I'm running for re-election. And so she's removed herself from a statewide campaign in the state of Georgia. Keisha Lance Bottoms is probably the most recognizable name here. She actually was floated as a potential contender for Biden's VP list back in 2020, but she served in his administration, but more notably to Georgia, was the mayor of Atlanta from 2018 to 2022. So she had a huge name and maintains a huge name. About 67% of voting population is in the Atlanta metro area, so certainly a huge motivational factor there. Up against now the former Republican lieutenant governor, all on the Democratic slate. Jason Estevez and a number of other candidates too also do really have, a chance at winning the nomination, but that's really the rundown on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, it's also quite interesting too. The Lieutenant Governor, Burt Jones, Lieutenant Governor to Brian Kemp, is running in this race. So the first Lieutenant Governor is running as a Democrat. The second one is running as a Republican. Chris Carr is Georgia's Attorney General. He's running as well. And a name that you certainly recognize, Brad Raffensperger, is running for Georgia Governor in 2026 as the Secretary of State. He is the one who Donald Trump despises, the one that Donald Trump infamously asked to find 11,000, roughly 800 votes in the state of Georgia to overturn the 2020 election, all on recording, all got released to the public. Raffensperger is not as popular amongst his party as you might think. Certainly very popular amongst the more middle-of-the-road, voters here. But when it comes down to what we're seeing here, when it comes down to Raffensperger, Burt Jones, and Chris Carr, Raffensperger might be a name you recognize. His odds at winning are not that high. And I think that what is interesting, though, is that it really just depends on the political calculus of the primary electorates in the state of Georgia. After all, Georgia is a state that Donald Trump did win in the last presidential election. Not by a lot, but he won it by roughly 2 points after losing it in the 2020 cycle. And, this state actually did swing by nearly the smallest amount, save Wisconsin as a state that went from Biden to Trump between cycles. Georgia was right there up there as a state that did not see too much of a shift. It was actually one of those few states where Donald Trump's margin shrunk relative, not to 2020, but 2016, when he was able to win a number of these same states. And it actually is quite interesting because Trump's margins were larger in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada he won when he did not win in the past 2 cycles, and Georgia is a state where the margin was closer. And so a lot of voters are going to be asking, on the margins here, Donald Trump did very well in 2024, even though he, underperformed his 2016 metrics, he was still able to flip back a state that Biden had won by a handful of votes in the 2020 cycle. Trump won it more decisively. The voters are going to ask, who can win this election? It's a very fair question, and it is one that is going to be a constant presence in the minds of voters in Georgia because there is a lot on the line here in Georgia should Republicans win this governor election. Should they have the ability to ride it out until the next census? Should they have the ability that Georgia would lend itself to giving Republicans near total dominant control in this state itself? Georgia's governor election will be one the Democrats will invest $100 million plus in. I can near guarantee that we are likely going to see that in this race, and there's good reason for that. But getting back to the main focus of this video being Jeff Duncan, we have to ask, will he win this primary, and could he win a general election? Now, as is the case, oftentimes with strong candidates in general elections, the primary, typically speaking, is often that biggest hurdle. Now, I'm not convinced that any of these Democrats are going to have a harder time getting the primary nomination than the general election, but I do think you're on that verge here with Jeff Duncan in specific, where I do think his odds of winning the general are higher than his odds of winning the primary. And that's because a primary is often the most partisan, most engaged, most aware voters in this race, not as much those middle of the ground voters who are looking for a conservative who turned against Trump, joined the Democratic Party, and championed these issues for the party. That might work on disaffected voters who didn't vote for Harris, but didn't vote for Trump, but would be willing to vote in 2026 and are looking for a candidate again. It's a very niche group, and it's a subtle one, but Georgia is a swing state. Absolutely goes back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. 2 Democrats in the Senate, yet Donald Trump won it on the presidential level. These things happen. But taking a look at what we've seen here, taking a look at just everything, all the dynamics of the Democratic primary, the Republican primary, it will be very interesting to see exactly who emerges. Because if it is the traditional Democratic primary electorate, I don't think that Jeff Duncan is the front runner. But if it does radically change because of the type of voter that Jeff Duncan is bringing in, or let's say the race ends up moving, further and further better for whatever it is, for a variety of reasons, maybe a great debate performance, huge fundraising thing, whatever it is. Seriously, whatever it is. You could find yourselves in a position where maybe Jeff Duncan is elevated. But as it stands right now, that traditional Democratic voting base would not seem to be all in for the former Republican lieutenant governor who just a few years ago described himself as pro-life. But, and here's the catch, if electability comes into play as the most prominent issue, he is someone who has won statewide before, and he did so in a blue wave year as the opposition. In 2018, Jeff Duncan won the lieutenant governor's race by a larger margin than Brian Kemp won against Stacey Abrams. Let that simmer for a moment. Because what that showed us was that Jeff Duncan was winning voters that voted for Stacey Abrams as a Republican. Because there were a lot of voters that felt that Brian Kemp's association with Trump was too heavy, that Donald Trump was very bad for the state of Georgia. That's why 2 years later they would go on to kick him out of office, even though it was temporary, and they would vote for him again 4 years after. But 2018 was a very different time, and Jeff Duncan's performance, arguably outpacing the top of the ticket, is undeniably impressive. The only problem here for Democrats is that this was when he was running as a Republican. But that really does beg the question. As someone who has that appeal, does he win over legions upon legions of independent voters that might look at someone like Chris Carr and say, you're too tapped in and associated with Donald Trump, I want something different. And what is palatable to me may not be a mainstream Democrat, but it is one that I believe to be more sensible because he shared some of the same beliefs that I hold today. Now, obviously, that's a lot of speculation, and that's not, my thorough political analysis on this. That is just, that could be the case where you could see the argument being made that he is extremely electable for the general election. Now, my honest take here is that once this primary is completed, we will have a better understanding of how the race will look up. Right now, I have the Republicans in the advantage because they came off the last cycle in 2022, winning this state by roughly 8 points, right? And so when you think about how, Biden only won this state by 0.2. Yes, Democrats have gotten lucky in the Senate races, but against remarkably poor candidates, we don't have necessarily remarkably poor candidates in the governor's race. Marjorie Taylor Greene briefly seemed like she was floating with the idea, denied that she was running for Senate, then kept open the idea that she might run for governor. Now she's denying that she's running for governor. It does not seem like Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to enter into this race, and that's good news for the GOP because she is someone who undeniably would immediately lose this governor election. I mean, I kid you not, she would be down 5 points to start and 10 by election day. And so thinking about what it looks like now, a lot of it is largely dependent on who the Democrats and who the Republicans nominate. And I will be very fascinated to see exactly what their decisions are. Because right now it is the Democratic Party who is vying and really, really, really wants control in the state of Georgia because they haven't had it in a very long time. And it has become a state that, although voted for them in 2020, has been remarkably unlucky at electing statewide Democrats, save the two senators, Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. Not in the lieutenant governor's race, not in the attorney general's race, not in the secretary of state's race, certainly not in the governor's race. Georgia has not had a Democratic governor in quite some time. You can look back and see, it's not too far. But you're going to find that, Georgia is not exactly that state that, Republicans or Democrats used to be able to say, we could rely on it unless you go back to 1998, which was the last time that a Democrat was elected governor. And so just thinking about, again, all of the things that are on the line here. Jon Ossoff's presidential bid, if he decides to go for one, would be contingent on what happens in Georgia in the midterm elections. It sounds weird, but let's say there's a Republican governor in Georgia, Jon Ossoff is tapped for VP or wants to run, a Republican incumbent will be appointed to replace them until the end of the term or until the special election is called. And I can guarantee you, as we've seen be the case with Republicans across this country, they will do any and everything to really delay votes, to make it so Republicans have that upper hand in the eventual Senate race under the idea that Jon Ossoff vacates his seat and ends up winning. And so again, these are all things that I think, might not necessarily be amazing to talk about on either side of the aisle. I think that there's a mixed bag of results here. But the fact is, the former Republican lieutenant governor is deciding to run for governor as a Democrat, and that is newsworthy. And that is really what is going to be interesting, because I do think that if we could snap our fingers and run to a general election, what I think would actually be the most fun race to watch, putting aside, the actual politics of it all, is the incumbent lieutenant governor under Brian Kemp running against the former Republican governor, lieutenant governor under Brian Kemp. And obviously, probably not going to happen. There's a slim chance that both of them make it to the nomination, but it would certainly be a debate at least worth watching where they can really compare and contrast their experiences. Now, this might be the strategy the Democrats want to try in Georgia because they're afraid of losing the race. I don't know. I think that this is something that would really have to be done very well in order for it to not inhibit and decrease Democratic turnout by, running those ads. Of 6 years ago, it was this Democrat running for governor who said that they wanted, pro-life X, Y, and Z, or they wanted whatever it might be. And as much as, again, people's opinions can change, the president of the United States right now has gone back and forth between pro-life and pro-choice depending on who he's talking to. But I do think that voters, especially base voters, can feel in a way that their candidate does not represent them to the same degree. However, if that is counteracted by massive amounts of support from crossover voters or just swing voters that are looking for a more tempered Democrat than the, stereotype that they might have about, Democrats nationwide, then that could also be a compelling case as to how he could end up in a position and winning. So certainly a lot to look at, certainly a lot to really dive into. I will see how this race ends up, because right now it stands to be a very competitive race, not only on the Democratic side, I know that's been the primary focus of this video, but also the Republican side as well. And the 2026 midterms, which are no easy bet for the Republican Party, could find themselves in a position where they are either narrowly winning Georgia or narrowly losing it. And the implications of it are quite vast and wide, and have a lot of impact on the 2028 race and potentially even the 2030 midterms. I know it feels a long way away, but we will be there in just a moment. I hope not, right? Because it's so fast to go through. But again, the 2026 governor's race in Georgia is taking a variety of different and interesting turns, and we will see exactly what happens with Jeff Duncan. I'd encourage you to keep watching him and seeing what he says to the press, with the press, how his interviews go, how he is received by Democratic voters, because after all, he is a former Republican. But if he can win the race, and that's an if he can win the race, there might be a case to be made to nominate him on the Democratic side if that's ultimately what Democrats value mostly. We'll see. That could be the circumstance. It could not be. But as it stands right now, it seems that that rumor that had spread a month, 2 months ago that we talked about, that Jeff Duncan would be running for governor, has come to reality today. And especially since it's happening as a Democrat, a huge party switch in about 6 years, really 4 years, and certainly one that will be felt should he win the governorship in Georgia politics for quite some time. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server if you go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2025-26 governor election and analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.